On this episode of the Ministry of Motion Pictures podcast.
The church had not always had such a hostile relationship to film. I went with a colleague up to the Library of Congress. We went back into old periodicals from the teens and the 20s, and we discovered that for the silent era, at least until the mid-20s, the church had a very vibrant and virile involvement in film.
The Christian film movement has a historian, and his name is Dr. Terry Lindvall. Dr. Lindvall has written 2 books on Christian film history. Sanctuary Cinema chronicles the history of Christian film in the silent era, and his follow-up book, Celluloid Sermons, co-authored with Andrew Quicke, covers the era of the 1930s up until 1986. Dr. Lindvall currently occupies the C.S. Lewis Chair of Communication and Christian Thought at Wesleyan University, and today he is my guest. This is episode 19.
We're on a mission from God.
I teach at Virginia Wesleyan University in a dual appointment in religious studies and in communication. So I have cross-fertilized these 2 fields for quite a while. I've taught in the past at Regent University, Duke University, and the College of William and Mary. And I grew up as an Army brat and would attend films on Saturday afternoon matinees. And then after graduating from high school, I went to Southern California to a small religious school where they forbade us for going to movies, as well as dancing, drinking, and going with girls who did as well. But we would sneak off to see films like Camelot, The Sound of Music, and near the end of our college career, films like Night of the Living Dead. And so we saw a lot of these great films and lesser films during this time. But then I went off to seminary, and when I went to Fuller Seminary, I had a professor who introduced us to theology and film. And so we'd not only watch Jesus films, but we'd watch animated parables. And it really began to kind of excite me. And then I applied because I didn't feel called to the formal ministry. I applied to the University of Southern California, and I got a scholarship, and I started studying there and received my doctorate there, working on the theory of communication and the writings of C.S. Lewis. I taught at Azusa Pacific University and taught courses on literature and film. And then when I came back to a place starting a university in Virginia Beach called Regent University, I was one of 7 original faculty members. I was made the film person because I was the only one who had background in it. And throughout the years there, we started a program, and our students did remarkably well. We had it was only graduate level, and many of them went on and created films that won Student Academy Awards against USC, UCLA, and NYU and other schools. So our Bird of a Cage was one of the first we won. We had about a score of them that were nominated, but Bird in a Cage and Turtle Races were our 2 big winners, beating the big film schools. And we were just a small school, but we had learned how to communicate the faith in more of a parabolic form. We were students of writers like Flannery O'Connor or C.S. Lewis or Graham Greene. And so we thought, how can we embed our Christian faith into stories that do not turn off secular audiences? And so we learned to speak in images and not religious language through our films. And so after teaching all of these courses, I was fortunate to teach in film history as well. And as I began to explore, I realized the church had not always had such a hostile relationship to film. And I went with a colleague up to the Library of Congress. We went back into old periodicals from the teens and the 20s, and we discovered that for the silent era, at least until the mid-20s, the church had a very vibrant and virile involvement in film.
A congregational minister from Connecticut wrote The Religious Possibilities of the Motion Picture, in which he really looked and saw that films could be used by the church. And he said, look, for example, at a parable like The Good Samaritan. He says it's very much like the films, this was in 1911, that we have a story taken from the daily newspaper. We have a story that's exciting. It's a robbery. You have characters who are religious, who are the villains, and you find that the other villains, who are the robbers, get away completely. And so this makes for a great motion picture, he said. And so what we need to do is find these parables in scriptures and use them as Jesus used them to make the audience try to figure out what's going on. Who is God? And what is God doing in our lives? And so many people in the teens and the 20s really began to embrace films. In fact, at a local church here, Christain St. Luke's Episcopal Church, in 1919, they created a theater in their church. And I found the old 1919 projector when I went up into their kind of attic, which was the film auditorium. And so many churches were taking up. Kodak Film gave over 2,000 projectors to the Presbyterian churches.
Huh.
And the Methodists had a centennial in 1919 in which 100,000 people came. And for a whole week, they had one of the largest outdoor theaters, and they would show all the films that churches could use. And so people were using film in churches, and there were hymns that were projected on walls. And so all of this kind of new stuff that happens in churches, hymn books were not used even as much as projected hymns and projected films.
Huh.
And so this happened until the 20s, when all of a sudden you get scandals in Hollywood, and people begin to become suspicious of film because there's more sex and violence coming in. And the church and the fundamentalists begin to pull away from culture, and you find this kind of gap where they actually leave film culture for about 40 years.
Wow. So it was really a reaction to the content that was being produced by Hollywood, not so much a reaction to the medium itself.
Exactly. They embraced the medium. Conservatives and liberals both used films during the teens and the early 20s. But suddenly when the scandals came out of Hollywood, people thought, this is a very corrupt culture. And you find that what happens then is that the religious people become censors rather than creators.
Yeah.
And when you have the Breen Code, the Roman Catholics really began to take the leadership of this during the production code era of the 30s and the 40s, 50s. And the Protestants are kind of behind. Now, the interesting thing is that the church will get back into film, and it's the Roman Catholics who have much more of a visual imagination. Unfortunately, we Protestants are still very propositional and very doctrinal, and we preach in our films rather than kind of tell stories.
Right.
And the Roman Catholics have a wonderful tradition in art in which they speak visually. And I think only recently have Protestant Christians learned to speak in parables and visually once again.
When I hear this, I'm thinking, okay, let's take an analogy. Let's go back to Gutenberg. Let's say the church embraced Gutenberg and the press at that time, but suddenly there were some pornographic books produced, and so the church would then reject all the printing press because it produced some pornographic books in some circles. To me, that seems like that's what happened in film.
Exactly. And they looked and saw some things they didn't like, and they just became suspicious of all of culture. Remember, this is also the time of the Scopes trial, and so you have the modernist versus the fundamentalist. And unfortunately, those two groups were the only groups around. There wasn't kind of a middle orthodox group that began to say, now, how do we really take culture and employ culture to communicate our message? But once they began to look back at the tradition of the church using images and icons and paintings, they realized there's much to be done. I think one of my favorite stories goes back to the 17th century monk. His name was Athanasius Kircher, and he kind of devised a magic lantern, which is the forerunner of the motion picture projector. And he would project images on the walls of his monastery. Unfortunately, he began to project images of ghosts and skeletons and devils. And so they thought, we better exorcise this monk, because look what he's doing. He's conjuring up the devil. And so he had to write a book. It's better to publish than perish, I guess. And he wrote a book on the art of light and shadow, and how God has given us this kind of invention to communicate good things. But most people had seen the devil in his images, and so they began to reject the magic lantern at that time.
Huh.
So very similar to motion pictures. But I think we've discovered now that you can use language and you can use film images for good or for evil.
Right.
It's much like the human tongue we have. We use our tongue for sweet or bitter words.
That's fascinating, because I've always wondered, why didn't the church embrace this mass media of communication?
The other thing, there are two other reasons why I think the church abandoned film. One was the cost. The cost became prohibitive once we move into sound in particular, and so it was very difficult to use sound equipment and film projectors that had sound in churches. And the other was, in 1922, the evolution of the radio. And preachers loved the radio. And so many evangelists, Amy Semple McPherson to start with, kind of one of the great women preachers of the 20s, they really ran to radio and said, now we can preach, preach, preach. And sermons became longer, and we left the visual for the verbal.
Now, I know that there was a few who decided to start their own studio so that they could compete with Hollywood.
Yes. Andrew Quicke, a colleague and I, wrote a book called Celluloid Sermons.
Yeah.
And Celluloid Sermons picks up after Sanctuary Cinema is the first book I wrote on the origins of the Christian film industry.
Yeah.
But Celluloid Sermons then began to look at how Christians, individual Christians had calls, like James Frederick, when he wrote did the Life of Christ series and then Paul series, the Great Commandment. He did some wonderful films. And I remember growing up in the 50s and going to church on Sunday night and seeing these almost like cliffhanger serials where you'd follow the adventures of St. Paul. And he was going to be lowered out of a basket in Damascus. And what would happen to him? He was about ready to be stoned. You'd have to come next week to find out how he escaped all of these things. And Frederick did a wonderful job of kind of employing all of this. And after World War II, there were so many sound projectors that were available, and they were given again to the churches. And so churches realized, we can start showing movies again to attract kids and the young in again. And so many different filmmakers started making these movies. You have the Moody science films, which were really ahead of its time. And they were like PBS documentaries. And I think people just were fascinated by how they tried to deal with science and faith and bring them together. But then many of the films became preachy, and they became very predictable. And so you have a kind of a really low-quality content to films in the 50s and 60s. Billy Graham tried with the Billy Graham Studios and did some amazing films, but unfortunately, he would always have to appear like Alfred Hitchcock did in his films as a cameo, but he was always kind of preaching, and so they became very preachy, and Christians would go to them, but we were preaching to the choir,
right?
And instead of kind of speaking parables to people that really didn't know what the faith was about.
Yeah, James Frederick, I read him in your book, Celluloid Sermons, when I was putting together this whole idea for the podcast, and I have a quote from him on the front page of my website, which is, "The motion picture camera, like the printing press, is a gift from God. We can use it for God's purpose." And
that's exactly it. That's great. Yeah, that's wonderful. Yeah, it was very exciting to find them. And my colleague Andrew Quicke now is working on the third volume of the series, which are box office kind of Christianity, of looking to see where it's gone since the 70s and the early 80s.
Oh, great.
Which brings us up to... So he's your next interview, and just a delightful British man. Worked with the BBC for many years and was a colleague of mine.
So when will this book be out?
Whenever Andrew finishes it.
Oh, okay.
Andrew he's been working on it for about 15 years.
Wow.
And the problem is new things just keep popping up.
Yeah.
But he and his students kind of have been working on it. And there are a couple other books, I think, that have come out as well. A fellow by the name of Parker did Cinema as Pulpit, looking at the Sherwood Forest films. And then Sue did James Frederick and the Cathedral films, looking back at them. And then Natalie Dupont, a French woman, wrote a book called Between Hollywood and Godlywood, looking at Walden Media and what they've done. So others have kind of picked up this mantle and begun exploring kind of this history and the future of Christian films.
Oh, I will put them in the show notes.
Good.
Yeah.
Yeah, so what I've done since then is gone back to looking and saying, how have Hollywood films preached throughout their history? And so that's led to several other books. The first one I wrote with another colleague is called Divine Film Comedies. And so we look at a series of comedies and different kinds of comedies to say, what are they saying about faith? And then how do they correspond? How do they find parallels in biblical stories? and it's been really kind of a very enjoyable book put out by Routledge. For example, we look at a film like Home Alone as a very religious film. Not only do we see a little kid kind of pray over his macaroni and cheese, but he escapes the burglars and goes to a church and has this encounter with a godlike man, old man Morley, who lives next door. And we find that this man is very interesting. And what Chris Columbus, the director, did is that he gives us hints early in the film that this man is very different. The first time we see him, he's in the drugstore, and he puts his hand on the counter, and we have a close-up of his hand, and there is a stigmata. There is this kind of nail print in his palm of his hand. It's been bleeding. The second time we see him in a close-up is when he's in the church with the boy, and we find a Band-Aid. He sees a Band-Aid on his hand, which is starting to heal. And he's there talking to the boy, and he says, most people are afraid of me, and they really don't know me. And so basically he's introducing himself as God to the boy in the church where they're singing Oh Holy Night. And the boy goes through his own confession. He says, have you been a good boy? He goes, yeah, well, no, not really. And so he confesses to the man. And then it's the old man who saves him with his mighty right arm at the end, and we see him reunited with his own children who've been alienated from him at the end, and his hand has been completely healed.
Right.
So it's even in this slapstick comedy, you've got these religious elements that are there. But from there, then, I went into looking at prayers in film because it fascinated me how many prayers are in major films. And going back to the silent era all the way up to today, we found hundreds and hundreds of prayers and how they are really significant in the movies. For example, African Queen, one does not think of as a religious film, but at one point, Katharine Hepburn and Humphrey Bogart are stuck in a swamp. It's dried up. They've been covered with leeches. He has a fever. He's dying. And Katharine Hepburn, who is this kind of Methodist missionary sister, she's there and she stops and she pleads with God to hear her prayer and say, Lord, please open your heavens for us and help us. We're not the best of people, but we seek your help. And within 20 seconds, the heavens open up, the rain comes down, it lifts their boat and takes them out of the swamp. It rescues them. And so we find moments like this in so many films. Even Easy Rider has several really positive films in this kind of hippie journey. And the first one is in kind of a Jesus commune where these Hispanics kind of pray in Jesus' name. And then we find hippies praying. And before they get to kind of the blasphemy at the end, when they're on their kind of drug trip, prayers are there portrayed as good and healthy in some context, and then as necessary even when evil things happen to them. One of the films that really has fascinated me recently that I didn't get into the book, that I find is one of the most redemptive films I've seen in a long time, is Bad Times at the El Royale. And in the film, there are 3 significant prayers that are answered in different ways. And it's like a Flannery O'Connor story or a Graham Greene story. You've got all of these characters, and they're all offered a moment and an opportunity for repentance and for grace and for redemption. And they don't take it. Most of them do not take it, much like in A Good Man is Hard to Find by Flannery O'Connor.
Yeah.
And so grace is there, and grace comes to those who basically humble themselves. It's just very, very fascinating.
Huh.
And so now my students are showing me prayers in other films that I've forgotten, and it's really kind of fun. But I've ruined them because every time they see a movie now, they call out the prayer.
So what are some Christian films that have been produced that we probably haven't seen that we should see?
Yeah, there's some in the silent era, like The Stream of Life, which are no longer extant, unfortunately, but they had a tremendous impact. I mean, it was the blockbuster of the day. But we move, and there's short films by Rolf Forsberg. Rolf Forsberg is a very creative director. In the 1964 World's Fair in New York City, he premiered one of his films called A Parable, which was really portraying Jesus as a white clown. And this is way before Godspell. But it's just, you see the kind of the life of sacrifice and the death and the hope that comes through Jesus in this allegorical film where the circus master is Satan, the one who controls the circus and controls all the performers. But this clown comes in to disrupt. and subvert everything that is there. I've always enjoyed John Schmidt's film, Super Christian and Kevin Can Wait. He always had a really kind of a good sense of humor and didn't take himself so seriously, and was able to kind of circumvent and be a little indirect in the way that he told his films there. And so there have been many out there like that.
Yeah, I think a lot of those you can find on YouTube. I found quite a few silent Christian films on YouTube in black and white.
A film that was controversial when it came out, which is called Strange Cargo, with Clark Gable and Joan Crawford and Peter Lorre and some other people. But it's a very interesting kind of Christ figure who comes among these people on Devil's Island. They all want to escape Devil's Island. And allegorically, it's corny, but it really works. The map to escape Devil's Island is written in a Bible. And each of these people really have an opportunity to get off the island. But, of course, most of them die. And then you've got a great film like Hacksaw Ridge, where the true story of Doss, this private, is just praying. He's a conscientious objector, a Seventh-day Adventist, and he goes over to war, and he just rescues so many men by praying to God, Lord, just one more. And so there's some very powerful films out there, but we've kind of missed them all. Yeah. And we miss realizing that they're saying something good.
Yes.
And horror films. Horror films are very interesting. Everything from Poltergeist to Nightmare on Elm Street uses the old New English primer prayer of "Now I lay me down to sleep." And generally the people who pray that are saved in these films. Not that I'm recommending them, but they still have that kind of power that is there. And I think you have a Christian director like Scott Derrickson, who did The Exorcism of Emily Rose, who really begins to kind of indirectly and quietly kind of show his faith. But unfortunately, most people just take films literally, and they don't begin to talk about them afterwards and say, what really is going on there? And then Denzel Washington, both of them have loaded their films with religious images and symbols and messages. Everything from Pale Rider to The Magnificent Seven have these kind of moments that we see. Then we have people that are basically satirize the faith, but even in their satire and their blasphemy, they are showing us something. They're revealing something. Now, not all the prayers in films are exemplary. They're not all there to kind of give us an example of how to pray. But one of the films that really shows us that who we are is Talladega Nights. And while I didn't like the movie overall, the prayer scene is powerful because Ricky Bobby, played by Will Ferrell, satirically recreates God in his own image as the 8-pound, 6-ounce baby Jesus. And everyone else in the film is creating Jesus in their own image. And that's what we do in the church. That's why we need kind of the scriptures, and we need community to kind of correct how we each kind of create the 8-pound, 6-ounce baby Jesus, or whatever Jesus we have, the American Jesus, the Democratic Jesus, the Republican Jesus. And that film kind of wakes us to how we stereotype our own faith tradition. And so I think it's very good. And another one that does that is Meet the Parents. And Meet the Parents is really funny in the sense that Ben Stiller's character has gone to a grocery store, and he hears the music of Godspell in the background, day by day. Dear Lord, 3 things I ask, that we could follow thee more nearly, seek thee more clearly, whatever it is. And we find that that's the prayer he gives. He's learned a prayer from movies that he prays now at the dinner table. Oh. And so it's very, very funny there. Huh. In fact, films in other places also teach us how to pray. We find in the Book of Eli, Denzel Washington again sits down with a young woman and shows her how to pray. And then in a film like, Easy A, Will Gluck's film, we've got Olive, who's played by Emma Stone. She goes into a confessional, and she confesses, I really don't know how to pray. I'm only going on what I see in the movies. So the movies have taught her how to do her confession that is there. And many films kind of teach us how to pray.
Are many of James Frederick's films available still?
Yes, they are. They are. In fact, I think they're coming out on DVDs fairly soon as well. And they're just really good Bible stories of Jesus and done with really good, much better acting than we have in something like The Greatest Story Ever Told, which has every Hollywood star in it, and it's so campy now. What was done. Oh, the other person who's doing these great films is Tyler Perry. Tyler Perry, in his Medea, is hilarious in how she tries to teach a young charge how to pray. Just really kind of indirectly does good stuff there.
Interesting. I remember a story you wrote in Celluloid Sermons about Frederick when he finally got financing together to make a feature film on 35 millimeter film stock, I believe, and had all these big name actors. And then once he got it released, the studio was going to release it, but the projectionist union was against him.
Yeah, there are all kinds of strange things went on with the film called The Great Commandment. And the other thing that was the problem with it was its message is love and forgive your neighbor. It's the Great Commandment. But unfortunately, it came out just as World War II was starting, and we were not in a mood to forgive the Japanese or the Germans. And so, it had other problems as well.
Do you find that there was resistance against Christian films?
No, I think not mostly. I think the problem was their exhibition occurred mostly in kind of church halls and church basements, and people are not they'll feel comfortable coming to churches, even to see movies, and then they feel like they're being hit over the head. One of the exceptions to that was one of the worst Christian films ever made, but most effective, and that was The Thief in the Night. And the kind of dispensational, post-apocalyptic films that come out where the rapture comes, and it has some really bad theology, but it's very effective. And there were many people that kind of confessed to having come to faith through fear through films like that and The Exorcist. But those kinds of films, even though they're really badly made, still have an effect. And so you've got to examine it both theologically, ethically, and aesthetically.
My conversation with Terry Lindvall will continue in the next episode. There are links to his books in the show notes at the Ministry of Motion Pictures website. I highly recommend them to any Christian filmmaker. They're both enjoyable and very easy reads. Looking ahead, Dr. Peter Leithart will join me to talk about Terrence Malick's glorious film, The Tree of Life. Thank you for joining me on the Ministry of Motion Pictures podcast. You'll find show notes and more information about us at www.ministryofmotionpictures.org.
What we do in life echoes in eternity.